The President of South Africa is the head of state and head of government of the Republic of South Africa. The President directs the executive branch of the federal government and is the Commander-in-Chief of the South African National Defence Force. Between 1961 and 1994, the office of head of state was the state presidency. The President is elected by the National Assembly, the lower house of Parliament, and is usually the leader of the largest party, which has been the African National Congress since the first multiracial election was held on April 27, 1994. The Constitution limits the President's time in office to 2 5-year terms. The first president to be elected under the new Constitution was Nelson Mandela. The incumbent is Cyril Ramaphosa, who was elected by the National Assembly on February 15, 2018 following the resignation of Jacob Zuma. Under the interim constitution, valid from 1994 to 96, there was a government of national unity, in which a member of parliament, MP, from the largest opposition party was entitled to a position as deputy president. Along with Thabo Mbeki, the last apartheid president, F.W. de Klerk also served as deputy president, in his capacity as the leader of the National Party, which was the second largest party in the new parliament. But de Klerk later resigned and went into opposition with his party. A voluntary coalition government continues to exist under the new constitution, adopted in 1996, although there have been no appointments of opposition politicians to the post of deputy president since. The president is required to be a member of the National Assembly at the time of the election. Upon election, the president immediately resigns their seat for the duration of the presidential term. The president may be removed either by a motion of no confidence or an impeachment trial. A number of manifestations of the office of president have existed. Aspects of these offices exist within the presidency today. The executive leadership of the British colonies of Natal and the Cape of Good Hope were vested in their governors. Likewise, it was invested in the presidents of the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Alternating sovereignty as a result of wars culminated in the Treaty of Vereniging, which concluded the South African War. The Union of South Africa, a British dominion, was established on May 31, 1910 with the British monarch as titular head of state, represented by a viceroy, the Governor-General. Following the 1960 referendum and subsequent declaration of the Republic of South Africa on May 31, 1961, the office of state president was created. It was originally a ceremonial post, but became an executive post in 1984 when a new constitution abolished the post of prime minister and transferred its powers to the state president. The country ended minority rule in 1994. The office of the president, and the roles that come with it, were established by Chapter 5 of the Constitution of South Africa. South Africa has a distinctive system for the election of its president. Unlike other former British colonies and dominions who have adopted a parliamentary republican form of government and those that follow the Westminster system, South Africa's president is both head of state and head of government and commander-in-chief of the South African National Defence Force, SANDF. Contrary to presidential systems around the world, the President of South Africa is elected by the Parliament of South Africa 5 rather than by the people directly. They are thus answerable to it in theory and able to influence legislation in practice as head of the majority party. The President is elected at the first sitting of Parliament after an election, and whenever a vacancy arises. The President is elected by the National Assembly, the lower house of Parliament, from among its members. The Chief Justice must oversee the election. Once elected, a person is no longer a member of the National Assembly. They must then be sworn in as president within 5 days of the election. Should a vacancy arise, the date of a new election must be set by the Chief Justice, but not more than 30 days after the vacancy occurs. The Constitution has thus prescribed a system combining both parliamentary and presidential systems in a unique manner. Only Botswana and a few other countries use a similar system. Between 1996 and 2003, Israel combined the two systems in an opposite way, with direct elections for the post of prime minister. Although the presidency is the key institution, it is hedged about with numerous checks and balances that prevent its total dominance over the government, as was the case in many African countries. The presidential term is 5 years, with a limit of 2 terms. Thus the electoral system attempts, at least on paper, to prevent the accumulation of power in the president as occurred during apartheid and as is the case currently in many other African countries. According to Chapter 5 of the Constitution, the President can only exercise the powers of the presidential office while within the Republic of South Africa. The President may appoint an acting President when traveling outside the country or unable to fulfill the duties of the office. A presidential vacancy should be filled first by the Deputy President, then a Cabinet Minister selected by the President, thereafter a Cabinet Minister selected by the Cabinet, and finally by the Speaker of the National Assembly. The President is the head of state, head of government and Commander-in-Chief of the South African National Defence Force. The rights, responsibilities, and remuneration of the President are enumerated in Chapter V of the Constitution of South Africa and subsequent amendments and laws passed by the Parliament of South Africa. The executive powers of the Republic are vested in the President, who appoints various officials to positions listed in the Constitution, the most significant of which are the Cabinet Ministers and Justices of the Supreme Court of Appeal and the Constitutional Court. The President's Cabinet implements and enforces the Constitution and laws and carries out the President's political objectives. Judges are appointed on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission. The President plays a role in the formation of legislation. The President can sign bills into laws or veto legislation, subject to an override, refer bills back to Parliament or to the Constitutional Court, or call for a referendum. The President summons Parliament, and often delivers a State of the Nation address at the beginning of each session. The President is the Commander-in-Chief of the South African National Defence Force, thereby possessing influence or control over foreign and security policy. The President is accorded the constitutional powers to declare war and make peace, negotiate and sign, although not ratify, treaties, and the alliances that may come with them, and receives and appoints diplomatic officials, confers honors, and grants pardons. F.W. de Klerk was the last president of South Africa where the system of apartheid was official policy. Pressure from the liberation movements, civil disobedience within the country, economic sanctions from the international community and condemnation by the religious community as well as pressure from the South African business community had rendered the system untenable. In 1993 de Klerk and African National Congress President, Nelson Mandela, were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of their efforts to bring an end to apartheid. Apartheid was officially ended on April 27, 1994 when Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. In line with the Freedom Charter, Mandela called all South Africans to a common goal of a South Africa for all who live in it. Mandela even paid a courtesy visit to Hendrik Verwoerd's widow in 1995 as part of his efforts in reconciliation. Since 1994, South Africa has had 5 presidents who have varied greatly in style and character, despite all belonging to the same political party. How do they compare? How did they handle the crises they faced? What impact did they have on the country? As the ANC's next elective conference approaches and Cyril Ramaphosa seeks a second term as president, South Africa is reeling from the effects of state capture and the COVID-19 pandemic. Coupled with an ailing economy and record unemployment, the need for good political leadership to steer us through the morass is more urgent than ever. It is, therefore, a perfect time to think critically about the role that presidential leadership plays in our lives and in history. To this end, the Presidents provides an honest assessment of the 5 post-apartheid presidents, Mandela, Mbeki, Motlanthe, Zuma, and Ramaphosa, examining their strongest qualities and greatest weaknesses in the context of the momentous challenges they faced. South African history in the 20th century was dominated by the rise and fall of apartheid, a form of government based on racial classification that placed power and privilege in the hands of a small minority of people of European descent and disenfranchised the large majority of the nation's population who are of African descent. The bitterness of 2 Anglo-Boer wars, fought between the British and Afrikaners, white South Africans primarily of Dutch descent, provided soil within which the Afrikaner nationalist ideology of apartheid could grow. In the tussle between Afrikaner and English South Africans, it was ultimately South Africans of color who lost out. The men who oversaw the rise and fall of apartheid were the nation's heads of government. In 1910 the two former Afrikaner colonies of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State were united with the two British-governed colonies, the Cape and Natal, to form the Union of South Africa under the British Crown. From this time, the South African government was led by a prime minister. Although they were Afrikaners, the early prime ministers, Botha and Smuts, took a reconciliatory stance between Afrikaner and English South Africans. Under Hertzog, privileges for working-class whites were entrenched and blacks were further disenfranchised. Apartheid, however, only became official government policy under the leader of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, Prime Minister D.F. Malan, who came to power in 1948. His successors built on this policy of segregation. H.F. Verwoerd in particular introduced what came to be known as Grand Apartheid, the separation of races on a macro scale. People of African descent were not allowed to own or rent land outside of small pockets of land known as homelands. The enactment of the scheme saw the mass relocation of black people to these homelands. In 1961 South Africa became a republic. Prime ministers continued to head up the government of the Republic of South Africa until 1984, when a new constitution was implemented and the state president became head of state. South African prime ministers. Original source, Martin Gibbs. Louis Botha, 1910 to 1919. South African prime ministers. Original source, Martin Gibbs. Jan Christian Smuts, 1920 to 1924 and 1939 to 1948. South African prime ministers. January 4, 1961. Original source, Martin Gibbs. James Barry Munich Hertzog, 1924 to 1939. South African prime ministers. May 9, 1953. Original source, Martin Gibbs. Daniel Francois Malan, 1948 to 1954. South African prime ministers. January 6, 1963. Original source, Martin Gibbs. Johannes Gerhardus Strijdom, 1954 to 1958. South African prime ministers. July 2, 1954. Original source, Martin Gibbs. Hendrik Fransk Verwoerd, 1958 to 1966. He was assassinated on September 6, 1966 at the Houses of Parliament in Cape Town. South African prime ministers. Original source, Martin Gibbs. Balthazar Johannes Vorster, 1966 to 1978. South African prime ministers. November 13, 1968. Original source, Martin Gibbs. Peter Willem Botha, 1978 to 1984. The position of prime minister was then abolished and he became state president from 1984 to 1989. President F.W. de Klerk. Original source, David Goldblatt/South Photos. F.W. de Klerk, 1989 to 1994. F.W. de Klerk was the last president of South Africa where the system of apartheid was official policy. Pressure from the liberation movements, civil disobedience within the country, economic sanctions from the international community and condemnation by the religious community as well as pressure from the South African business community had rendered the system untenable. In 1993 de Klerk and African National Congress President, Nelson Mandela, were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of their efforts to bring an end to apartheid. Apartheid was officially ended on April 27, 1994 when Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. In line with the Freedom Charter, Mandela called all South Africans to a common goal of a South Africa for all who live in it. Mandela even paid a courtesy visit to Hendrik Verwoerd's widow in 1995 as part of his efforts in reconciliation. Thank you for watching this video.